friends, and welcome to the first episode of the Scratch Art series. Before we begin working on the different steps you're going to learn with this project, I want to just briefly explain what it is that we are doing. So we are working on something that's called Scratchboard. It looks like this. You've probably seen it from when you were little. There's like the kind that has white behind it and the kind that has rainbow colors behind it. But the cool part about Scratchboard is that there is a background. So there's this black film that's laid out over the top, and it's really kind of cool because if you take a scratching tool, you can slowly remove that black film. And what's great about this is that we've got these really sharp little points on these tools, so we can add really fine details going through and just making these little marks on the Scratchboard paper. So your project is to choose an animal of your choice. You can choose your own animal, so you can pick your pet. You can find a different photograph of types of animals that you do like, and then you can use that for this project. Here are two examples of this project that were completed by Centennial students last year. So the steps that I'm going to be teaching you today are building up to working on the animal of your choice. So we're going to learn a bunch of different techniques before we actually get started on this project that will make your final result a lot more successful. So let's get started. To begin the hatching value scale, you're going to start the same way that we'll start for all of these value scales, which is filling in a section to represent the darkest area of this value scale. And we're going to fill in just a solid box of black value on the left-hand side of each one of these value scales. And we're going to leave it solid because that's representing the black end of that value scale. So once we've added that, we're working with only vertical lines to add in our hatching. So we're going to slowly start filling in this space just with hatched or vertical lines. And I'm going to go through and fill in some going all the way to the end, just so that I can kind of use that to help myself figure out the pacing for how fast my value should be fading. I also filled in some of the value in the middle area of my value scale to represent more of the medium tone. And I did that just to make sure I wasn't fading too quickly, because often students will fade to white too soon so that more of their value scale is left white, when really just the end of their value scale should be left white. As you can see, I'm going through and adding lines in between those lines that I've already added. And that's just making these lines closer together, and there's going to be more of them, which will make it appear like it's a little darker than the areas that have fewer lines or areas where the lines are spaced out more. Once you've added your lines, you're going to go back through and continue adding layer after layer after layer of these lines to make sure that you don't have any solid sections that show up. So this step will take you a little bit of time because you have to go back and over it again. I'm also taking the time to go up against the edges and fill in value there, because when you're working vertically with lines that are going straight up and down, it is really hard to make sure that the edges are filled in with value as well, because you naturally want to stop your line a little bit sooner so that you don't go outside of that value scale section. So it's perfectly fine if you need to go back through and fill in a couple more areas up against those edges, maybe even going back over again to add another layer to make sure that your value transitions are nice and smooth. So it will take you multiple passes, and if you finish in one pass, that means that it is not to the level that it should be. Before you begin the cross-hatching value scale, I would like for you to sharpen your pencil either electrically or manually, and that's because we are working with lines, and these lines need to be fairly thin, and if you are working with a dull pencil, this is going to be a much more difficult step for you. So similarly to how we started our hatching value scale, we're going to begin by just filling in a dark square of value so that it's filled in and nice and solid before we begin adding our lines. Now with cross-hatching, we're adding multiple layers of lines, which means that we're actually going to start our first layer much lighter than we think we're going to need to. So I'm just doing my best to go back through and add lines in between these lines that I've already started to add, and remember that we're still trying to make this a lighter layer because we have to come back over the top with a different direction of lines for cross-hatching. So when we add that second layer, it's actually going to make it quite a bit darker. While you're doing this, you want to make sure that your lines stay at a consistent angle, so just double checking that again and again as you're continuing on, and double checking to make sure that you don't have any sections of value or any abrupt changes where it goes from dark to light very quickly. Our goal is to make all of our transitions as slow and drawn out as our value scale allows us to with the space provided. The last step I completed for this cross-hatching value scale was to go back over it again one more time with those vertical lines, just using that to help my transitions become a little smoother, to make sure that you can see the direction of both lines, because cross-hatching requires that you see that overlapping layer of different directional lines. Once you've got both of these sections done, you can take an eraser and just use that to clean up that space in between your value scales and around your value scales. I would recommend only erasing in between two sections that are complete. So notice I'm not erasing underneath that second section that I did, because I still have to go back through and add value to the scale beneath it. To begin the stipple value scale, we'll start in the exact same way we have for all of the others, which is to fill in a very dark, solid black box at the end of that value scale to represent that darkest value. From there, we're actually going to use a bit of a different technique to help this go by faster, because if any of you have done stippling before, it takes forever. So one recommendation I would make is to save the stippling until the very end, where you can see the little dots that you're adding. And while you're working on filling in the dark and medium tones for this, I would actually use what's called a scribble technique, which is where we're trying to put all of our lines really close together, and we're using a small circular motion, and that allows just a small little bit of that white to show through. And so that's what we're looking for, is just a small amount of white to show through. And once we've made our way to the middle of this value scale, that's when we're going to start switching to working with just dots. I want you to notice that while I'm working with this scribble technique, the circular motions I'm making are very small. If you're working with really large circular motions, it's going to look like a scribble rather than a stipple, which we're trying to make this look like we're adding just a bunch of tiny little dots without actually having to do that. So I would recommend working with really small circular motions for that scribble motion. And once you start adding in your dots, you can still sort of do that scribble motion. As you'll see here, I sort of add both at the same time. So I'm adding a little bit of scribble technique and a little of those dots independently as well. As you're working, don't forget to go up against the edges to fill in those areas that are easy to forget about. I would also recommend that as you continue working on this value scale, that you really start to think about spacing out your dots in a slow transition. So you want them to start out really close together and then slowly start to space farther and farther apart from each other. So I actually went through and added those before I was completely finished with all of my value, and I did that so that I could see what I needed to do to make it a smooth transition. So after I added all of my lighter tones in, I just went through and figured out the areas that needed just a little bit more to fill it in and make it an even texture. Now that you've got another value section shaded, you can go back through and erase the space that's in between those two sections. Once again, we begin in the exact same way by laying out our darker area, filling it all the way in, and going from there. From here, we're going to start working in the exact same way we did starting the stipple, which is by drawing multiple small circles, all really close and tight together, so that it's filling in that space almost completely solid dark. We do want just a few of those white spots showing through, and as we continue, we want to increase the size and quantity of those white spots that are showing. For this technique, it's really all right that you can see your lines because it's the scribble technique, so we're trying to show just sort of a tangle of lines all together. So you don't have to worry about just going down to the small dots. But we are really focused on making sure that those white spaces that show through after you're done with adding your small little circles are increasing in amount and making sure that it's fading with a smooth transition from that dark to medium to light. Creating light values with the scribble technique can be a little bit tricky because you don't want to end up with just a bunch of really dark circles drawn in your light value area. So you can actually change the value by pressing lighter with your pencil as you're creating those little scribbles at the very end, and that will make a really big difference. I would also recommend trying to make sure they're really spaced out and you just have a few showing so that it's a nice smooth transition. Don't forget to add multiple layers, especially for the scribble technique. It's going to make a really big difference in making sure that it's smooth. Don't forget to continue sharpening your pencil before each value scale. By now you can probably guess how we're going to start this value scale, which is filling in your darkest value. The crisscross value scale is working with just horizontal lines, and so that means that we're going to start by adding a section of horizontal lines leading out from that dark patch. Now, something that's going to be really helpful for you while you're working on this technique specifically is to make sure that the edges that you leave are very staggered. So you don't want to have solid edges lined up right next to each other. What I mean when I say that is that we've got these edges where it's a solid line, and we want to make sure that each of these sections that we add a different value in has a very random ending edge. So we want to almost make it like sort of zigzaggy back and forth instead of just directly above each other, because then it's really hard to blend these sections together. So we're just going to keep adding those layers of horizontal lines, making sure that they end in different areas. We don't want them to all end in the same spot, because another problem that can cause is it might make that edge a little bit darker than you meant for it to be, because when sections line up on top of each other and they overlap in the exact same spot, then you get some random patches of dark. So that's just something to look out for. So as you can see, I'm slowly starting to space out these lines from each other. So we want to have more white starting to show through. And our goal is to make this really random. We don't want to have any columns. We don't want to have any specific patches where it's dark or light. We just want to have a nice smooth transition so that it's showing more white from the background. The last step to complete your value scales is to go back over it one more time, and you're adding another layer of each one of those different techniques. And your goal is to try and make your value scales look like they're fading at the same pace. So you want to go back over and fill in any areas or even erase any areas just to help those value scales match each other in the way that they transition. You're also looking to see if you can find any solid sections of value so that you can go back over the outside edges of that space and help it blend into its surroundings a little bit better. Your next step is to shade in the sphere using the stipple technique. So to begin, we're actually going to make little marks showing where that darkest value reaches to. So notice that that dark value makes sort of a crescent moon shape, and it comes to points right at those little marks. So that darker value does not go all the way around our sphere. It's only located on that left side. Next, we're going to sketch in the basic area of where our highlight will be located, and it's going to just be a circle near the top right section of that sphere, and we want to make sure that it's going up against the edge similarly so that we have two crescent moon shapes and one circle. Our next step is to go through and fill in that darkest value area in that first crescent moon shape. And I'm starting just by filling it in with just solid value. I'm not even using any type of scribble technique because we do need to fill in that solid value first. Next, I'm going to come over and add those small circular patterns over the top of that dark value to help it transition from a perfectly dark value to just a slightly dark value. As you're working, keep in mind that you want these circular shapes to be very small because we are eventually leading out to the stipple, which is just a bunch of little dots. So our hope for this step is to imply that there are a bunch of little dots put together, but if you're using too large of circles to fill in this space, it's just going to look like lines rather than like dots. Once you get to this point where you've got about ½ an inch before you reach that highlighted circle, we're going to switch from the scribble technique to working with the stipple technique. So that means that we are working with just little dots and we're trying to fill them in so that it's a nice smooth transition. So since these dots are right next to a very dark value, we want to make sure that the dots are very, very close together so that it helps it show a smooth transition from dark to medium to light. So what you should be looking for is how much white space is left in between all of the things that you're drawing in. So you want to have it start out with very few spots of white and then slowly transition so that you've got a lot of white in the background and a few dots showing. So once you've reached the area that is outlined for your highlight, that's where it's really important to start spacing out these dots. Now, looking at the sphere, the only area that's left white is actually just a very small circular highlight. So we drew that larger circle so that we would know that that area needs to be lighter, but it's not going to be left perfectly white. You have to go through and start adding in those dots that are spaced apart. And from there, you're just going to make one last pass over the top of your sphere to make sure that you have smooth transitions. So this is your chance to go back through and fix any imperfections, to fill in any areas that might need a little bit more value, and to pay attention to your reference photo and try to your best to make it match. The next step is to add the shadow underneath your spheres. So we're going to begin by adding just that darkest value that you can, and it's going to fill in the center of that scrunched oval that's down at the bottom, representing the shadow space. So we're going to fill the center of that oval with our darkest value. From there, we're going to switch to using that small circular motion to imply the medium tones, and then we're going to slowly start adding in some little spots just to make it match the top with that stipple effect. And there you go. To begin the second sphere, which is the scribble technique, we'll start in the exact same way we started with the first one. So we're drawing that first crescent moon and the second crescent moon with that circle. You can also add in the darker value, just the same way as we did for the first sphere. From there, we're going to start adding in those small circular motions for the scribble technique, and we want to make sure that the amount of white that's showing through in between those circles stays fairly minimal. Once you've filled in that crescent moon shape with your darkest value, you're going to start spacing out your circles just a little bit more than you were. So you want to have more of that white background start to show through. With the sphere we completed prior to this, we were focused on making tiny little dots. But on this side, we can just continue that circular shape and have it just fill that space. We don't have to worry about changing our technique. Our main focus is making this a nice smooth transition, and it is an easy mistake to fill in too much when you're working with the scribble technique. So you need to make sure that you're really starting to space out the circles that you're making as you are going towards that lighter value. So you're going to actually end up with larger circles when you're spacing them out enough to have that much white show through. The size of the circle you're drawing is going to actually change. To help make this a smoother transition to my white highlight, I chose to erase that circle or guideline that I gave myself to know where my values were going to change. So now that it is gone and my line is removed from that space, I can slowly start to space out those circles with that circle scribble texture even more. So we're really trying to have it just have a smooth transition from dark to medium to light. The next step is to fill in the shadow that's underneath this sphere. So again, we're going to start with our darkest value, filling in that horizontal oval that's marking the area the shadow will fill. So we're trying to fill in that darkest value directly underneath the sphere, and then we're going to slowly start transitioning into a medium tone by pressing lighter with our pen and by starting to space out those circles even more so that you've got more white showing through. You'll complete this shadow area by filling in that medium tone all the way up against the edge of that horizontal oval, and you can even continue it just a little bit farther out, which you would do in an actual drawing, but I was just showing you where that edge and shape would be, so if you'd like to continue it out, you can. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode of the Scratch Art series. I hope that learning these value techniques today was really helpful to you to see it broken down step by step. And we will be using these same techniques, but using them in a different way for our next episode. So I will see you soon for that.